This is McElroy McKinney from the Bardic College. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition, or AD&D 1E, may have had some of the most confusing rules surrounding initiative and combat rounds. Most people that have played multiple editions of D&D are familiar with the idea of a surprise round, but AD&D 1E didn't actually have a surprise round. It actually had a process for determining the number of segments lost to surprise, and the only actions that could be used against the surprise characters are actions that took the same or fewer segments as the segment lost to surprise. Are you confused yet? You should be. Apparently, it's usually not a surprise that someone with a greatsword is going to attack you.
And now we present to you Thac0 with Advantage.
Welcome to Thac0 with Advantage. We're two friends that have been playing D&D a long time. While we both love lots of other RPGs, D&D still acts first in all of our rounds of gaming. Hi, I'm Ange, and I've been gaming for over 35 years. In 2014, I started writing for Gnome Stew, and I've been running the Gnomecast, the Stew's podcast, since 2017, and in 2021, I kind of became head gnome. I should probably stop saying I became head gnome because I've been head gnome for a little while now.
You are head gnome.
But yeah, it's weird.
Hi, I'm Jared, the review gnome at Gnome Stew, and I've been gaming since roughly 1985. In addition to writing reviews at Gnome Stew, I've got my own site, whatdoiknowjr.com, where I write additional reviews and opinion pieces on a variety of RPGs. So today, after we look at the games we're running in the campaign journal, or not, we'll get to that in a moment, we'll be talking about initiative in D&D 5e. Then we'll have some recommendations of D&D related content for you to check out in our downtime research segment.
Let me just finish up this campaign journal.
I have nothing. Nothing. City of Cowls game got canceled because the GM was sick post his cruise. Cygnus de Gure, formerly known as the Undermountain campaign, got canceled because the GM and his partner had an unexpected appointment come up for the weekend, so he had to cancel. And as Jared will cover, we also weren't able to play the Marodi game. But I have been playing a bunch of Baldur's Gate 3, and while that's not the same as sitting down at a table to play with friends, I think there's a lot we GMs can learn from Baldur's Gate 3. You have to be careful of what lessons you take from it, though, because I can see, just as we talk about GMs getting caught up in the Matt Mercer effect, where they feel like they can't run because they can't do the voices and they can't be Matt Mercer. Like, no, Matt Mercer doesn't even want you to be Matt Mercer. He's got a copyright on that. But if you tried to craft your game to match the depth of detail in Baldur's Gate 3, you will break yourself.
Yeah.
There is so much there. But I think the thing it can teach us is be open to adjusting to what your players are interested in exploring.
Yeah.
That's one of the beauties of Baldur's Gate 3. I'm in my second playthrough. I decided to play a Dark Urge my second playthrough. And it's interesting. Of course, it's me, so I'm still trying to be a white hat, which means I'm going resist urge. But at the same time, it's already a very different playthrough than my first playthrough, where I played a, fairly basic bard. And it's all a matter of just the little details you explored. Lean into what your players are interested in. Actually, after we record, I'm going to go play some more. It's a good game.
What you're saying here is the proper formula to not regular D&D gaming is about like 10 times more Baldur's Gate 3 equals 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say we didn't have our regular Thursday game, so that won't be happening until April 4th. And I don't have my monthly Saturday game until the 9th, so I got nothing, and I'm having withdrawals, and I keep playing other video games and beating them and not going back to Solasta, and it's not because I don't like Solasta, it's because every time I start playing it again, I want to start over and, do everything from scratch and think this is exactly the kind of people I want in my party and everything. But I need to finish Solasta because I told myself I'm not going to play Baldur's Gate 3 until I finish Solasta.
And tell us, what is the latest superhero game you started playing?
Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
I will throw out, because we have nothing else in this segment, I'm just going, and we're not going to put this in downtime. It's kind of interesting that the Tome of Beasts 1 from Kobold Press is on D&D Beyond now. So I guess we could wrap that into this segment as I'm going to look at the Tome of Beasts 1 on D&D Beyond to prepare for a future gaming session that will happen at some point.
Welcome to the Dungeon Master's Workshop.
Initiative is one of the rules in D&D that predates the game itself. It is an artifact of the game's wargaming roots where they needed to determine who went first between opposing forces. Switching focus from armies to individual heroes didn't change the need to know who goes when, hence the need for initiative in our games. We decided to take a deeper dive into the rules for initiative, from the history to why we use it, to alternative ways to do it, and even some best practices, so everyone at the table gets to contribute. So let's start off talking about what initiative looked like in previous editions.
What's really funny about this is when we were first talking about doing this topic, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to write this all down the way I remember it. And then I thought, no, I'm going to do research and actually look in some of the older books and make sure that I remember them properly. And then I realized I don't think I ever read AD&D first edition initiative in all the places that it exists.
There's a reason there were arguments about how to do things back in the day.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the very basic thing from the beginning was you started off with side initiative. And that means that everyone on one side has one number, everyone on the other side has another number, and whoever rolled highest gets to go first. One of the things that is kind of interesting about that, though, is depending on the ins and outs of a few different editions, it wasn't you get to go move and then, attack or shoot somebody. It was, your first phase was you would move. And then the other side would move. Then you get to do your missile attacks. And the other side would do that.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah. So it was kind of interesting. And also the big thing in a lot of initiative systems up until pretty much, I guess second edition didn't harp on this quite as much. But in like first edition and basic, you had to declare what you were doing before, at the beginning. You couldn't change your mind. Like, I'm going to cast a spell. And then when it gets to be your turn, you decide not to cast a spell. It's like, if you decide not to cast a spell, you aren't taking a turn now because that's what you're planning on doing.
They still did the side initiative in second edition, right?
Yes. Second edition is interesting because second edition really, the interesting thing about first edition is there are a ton of rules that became optional because people either didn't see them or understand how they worked. Second edition actually called out rules as being optional. So the intentional way things were supposed to work in second edition was you are rolling a 10-sided die instead of a d6, and whoever rolled lowest goes first. Now, the reason that it's lowest goes first is because in those optional rules, you might be adding weapon speed factor or the time it takes to cast your spell, but that was only if you were using the optional rules where you were doing individual initiative, which was optional.
See, I have to confess that a lot of my memories of initiative from first and second edition is kind of muddied because I ended up shifting from playing second edition to playing more champions, which you had a speed rating and that determined how many times you got to go in a round. And then there was Shadowrun, which also had its initiative back in the day was complicated.
It was, and it's actually interesting if you go back to the first edition that we were talking about, if you got multiple attacks in a round, that was actually the main thing that your speed factor was for, because that was telling you, okay, if I get a second attack and they get a second attack and I'm using a greatsword, their second attack comes before my second attack. Because all of that was very important.
So it was with third edition that we shifted to rolling a d20 and adding our initiative modifier. I'm sorry, our dex modifier.
Exactly. And what's interesting about that too is like AD&D first edition actually goes out of its way to say, when you're fighting a massive battle on a battlefield with two sides, dexterity won't matter. It's just going to be, the luck of the draw who gets to act first. And third edition said no.
No. I think by then there had been enough games out there that had said, hey, this character that has a high dexterity, high agility gets to do more in combat. And like the concept had kind of moved away from the wargaming origins of initiative and just it was luck of the draw. It was, no,
Mhm.
it's like these people actually are faster.
Yeah. And the interesting thing that 3rd edition also did was, I cannot imagine, I never tried to do the individual initiative in 2nd edition, but if I had done that, I cannot imagine doing that every single round.
Oh, God, no.
And that's what it expected you to do. And 3rd edition came along and said, no, you roll initiative once, and that's the order in which you are going, asterisk. Because 3rd edition also had where you could hold your action, which means if you go before other people, you could decide to just not do anything, and then say, hey, I'm going. You couldn't interrupt someone else's turn. So like they couldn't, you couldn't like, disrupt them doing an action, but you could say, well, I actually went at initiative count 20 and now it's initiative count 10. So now I'm going to go.
And I mean, like, that was super handy for characters like, hey, Angelique's playing these rogues where your benefits depended on whether or not you were flanking with somebody. And if you go first because you've got that high initiative, you're kind of screwed. You kind of want to wait until somebody else is in position before you get in position. And
Jared playing clerics all the time. That was handy for, okay, you do something in combat and get injured first, then I'll go.
Yeah. There are times where going first is always kind of cool, but it wasn't always what you needed.
And then the other thing was you could, which this is still in the game, you could ready an action, which is once this condition is met, that's when your action happens. And that actually let you interrupt something that somebody else was doing. Both holding and readying changed your initiative number. So what I said there at the beginning about how this is the order that you're going in, that wasn't always true, because if you held or readied an action, your initiative is now where you finally went later on.
I think the only time I ever used readying an action in 3rd edition was when TJ sicked some wyverns on us, and they were flying down and attacking us and then flying away, and we couldn't hit them because none of us have the range to do it. And so he finally, helpfully, before murdering the entire party, suggested you could ready an action to hit it as it swoops down. Oh, why didn't you tell me that? I didn't know that was an option.
There were actually a few adventures, I think. Possibly these might have been Pathfinder adventures, but some adventures that, like, tactics-wise, that's what it was saying. It's like, these things are going to attack at range and swoop in, and unless they ready, they're just going to keep swooping until they're dead.
Yeah.
Hopefully your players figure out that they need to ready an action to hit these things.
Now, what about 4th edition? Was there anything different that 4th edition did with initiative?
I don't think so. And this is the problem, is that I own a bunch of PDFs of other editions. I don't have that many 4th edition PDFs. Most of the PDFs that I have for 4th edition are the Dungeon Master's Guide and some of the, like, the Shadowfell setting guide stuff and everything, because I still like the advice that's in there and some of the other things. So here's the other thing. Me, when I was playing 4th edition, I was paying for the I forget what it's even called now, but the digital tool set.
The character builder. The character builder was crucial in playing 4th edition because it was a little too cumbersome to make a character without being able to just plug your stuff in there and get your printouts.
And if you had a subscription to that, the new content would just go in there. So, like, once there were new classes, they were in the character builder, and I'm paying my monthly fee, so I get the new characters. So I really didn't get any of the hardcover books beyond the first ones.
Yeah.
Because I was like, you know what? I'm not running this, so I'm just gonna use this through the character builder. Thus, I can't 100% say this, but I do not think that things changed a whole lot from 4th edition, except you did not have some of the fiddly action economy that 3rd edition had, because by the end of 3rd edition, they had introduced things like immediate actions, which you could take whenever you had something that could be used as an immediate action. And, this was before reactions, so therefore there was no limit. So if you had 10 spells on your spell list that were all immediate actions, you could just start, throwing these out as long as you had spell slots. And I say this because I had a player who had a bard that was using immediate actions so often. It was even driving my players crazy, because they, even though they were benefiting from it, were like, I just wanted to hit this guy. Like, I don't want you to stop everything and set this up. I just want to hit the guy.
Hey, it's Chris here. I wanted to jump in on 4th edition initiative. So a lot of the stuff is the same from 3rd edition. The ready in action, the delay action are there in the game. They change your initiative. There are immediate actions in 4th edition, which were triggered powers, interrupts, and reaction powers. They didn't change your initiative, except for a weird exception in the rules, since the ready in action changes your initiative, but is considered a reaction, which generally doesn't change your initiative. This is an example of the specific rule overriding the general rule in this particular game's design. I would also like to add that the biggest difference was that you added half your level to the roll, your initiative roll too, just like every roll in 4th edition, which is the precursor to the proficiency bonus 5th edition has.
So let's talk about 5th edition and initiative in 5th edition, because it is very similar to how 3rd edition works, but they have smoothed some of the stuff out, I believe.
Yeah. You don't hold your action in 5th edition. And the other thing that is interesting is that when you ready an action, you take your action whenever it is triggered, but your initiative score does not change. So you act at that point in the initiative in that round, and then next round you go back to your original score. And there aren't a lot of things that change your initiative order or your initiative score once you roll it in 5th edition. There's a few things, but there's not many.
I think we can say they did codify what you can do on your turn.
Yeah.
You have a move action, you have an action, and then you have a bonus action, and then you can have a single reaction.
Yes. Which helps cut all of that stuff down, because then even if you, it is in a lot of ways, it's sort of like concentration. There are things that were problems in previous editions, and some people thought the way to fix that is, okay, let's just get rid of any spells that boost somebody because they're a pain. And what they actually did in 5th edition was say, no, we don't need to get rid of those. We just need to make sure you're not starting combat and doing 20 of those boost spells before you even get into combat.
Yeah.
So that's where concentration comes in. And reactions are that same thing. Like, we can give you something that will trigger when something happens outside of your turn, but you're only going to get to do it once.
The shield spell is beautiful. It really is. It took me a long time to understand how it actually worked. But once I saw it in play, I'm like, oh, why don't I have that?
And the funny thing is, it works the way I always pictured it working, because like, if you read in a novel that a wizard has cast a shield spell, it's not, well, as we got into combat, I stopped and thought I would cast shield. It's always like this reflexive thing where it's like, oh, this attack is coming in and boom, I put up this magical force field. And now it works that way.
Mage armor is what you cast earlier.
Yes.
Why would we tinker with initiative? Why would we change what is rules as written, Jared?
First of all, I'm going to say that often we are bored nerds and we like to tinker with rules. I am not saying that judgmentally, because I have been a bored nerd and will be again that just wants to tinker with something.
Well, I think there's also times where you run into something that doesn't feel optimal for the players. For example, the whole readying an action thing. I'm fine with not having holding an action being a thing anymore, but it really sucks when you ready an action and then nothing happens to trigger it, and so your entire turn is wasted.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I mean, some of the other things I was thinking is sometimes you want things to be more predictable, sometimes you want them to be less predictable, and you can turn those dials by tweaking how initiative works by making things more or less predictable. You can also make things a little more strategic or less strategic, depending on, like, anytime you give somebody more flexibility. For example, just to throw another initiative system out there, in Genesis, you roll for where your side goes. So you have, like, if you have 4 people, you roll to see when those 4 people go, but anyone can take one of those slots.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually lets you do a lot more strategic planning that way, because then you're like, okay, we need to blow up this bridge first, and then we'll drop the frag grenades on them, so it lets you do that.
Yeah, and it's just sometimes I think the big one is people will find getting in and out of combat can be very cumbersome, especially if you're God bless the GMs that still want to run with 8 or more players. If you are trying to run 8 players or more, plus all of the monsters they're fighting, and you didn't give all of the monsters the same initiative and all of this, you're kind of cycling through 20 different initiatives. Mm-hmm. That's going to make combat really cumbersome and take a long time to get through.
And one of the other things, you talked about, sometimes people want to just get in and out of combat without it being cumbersome. That is actually part of what got me thinking about initiative, was looking at the Daggerheart playtest from Darrington Press, because their whole point was they wanted it to be more narrative so that you don't stop and roll initiative. If somebody attacks somebody, they attack someone. And then if somebody else wants to attack, they attack. And it doesn't go back to the GM until somebody rolls with fear, which is a thing in that game, or they roll a failure. And then it goes back to the GM, and then the GM can spend a number of action tokens equal to however many people went before they rolled a failure to activate their characters. And that is meant to kind of cycle in and out of combat faster, so that it's not like everybody stops and rolls initiative. It's just somebody gets mad and decides to stab someone in the face, and it's just part of the normal resolution of the game.
Let's take a second and talk about, we mentioned this in the opening. Why do we use initiative in the first place? Because like you say, with Daggerheart, it's narrative. It's like, who's actually doing the things, just deal with them. But why would we use initiative in D&D?
This is actually really interesting, because this is a conversation that kind of blew up around Daggerheart, because there were people saying that, well, people that play D&D all the time don't understand how to share table space with other people and don't let other people go when they're supposed to. And then there are people that only play D&D saying, these narrative games, that's ridiculous. How do you understand how combat works when somebody can just do whatever they want? And the real fact of the matter is, in a more narrative game, there are less granular tactical solutions. So it's a lot easier to say, I'm in combat, I'm going to do this thing, it's resolved this way, now we can move on to something else. D&D very specifically has a lot of granular tactical options. There are X number of spells for each level of spell that exists in the game, and you multiply that by divine and arcane spells, and each one of those does a different thing. When you reach that level of granularity, and that's just spells, there are class features, there's all sorts of things, and when you reach that level of granularity, you kind of need to slow everything down and make sure that everybody remembers and knows that they have time to use all of these features that they have. And a game is not better or worse because it has more or less granular features. It is what you feel like playing at the moment.
Now, I will say that those people who say D&D players don't know how to share and would just dominate, excuse me, that's just rude. I will say, as a GM, I like initiative because I can make sure that every single person at that table gets a chance to do a thing. I run a lot of more narrative games. I run a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse. I run Tales from the Loop. I run a lot of different games. And I still fall back on some concepts of initiative to make sure I get around the table and make sure that every person gets to do something in that action scene. It may not be a traditional combat encounter like you would see in D&D or Pathfinder or a more mechanical game like that, but it's still making sure you're getting around the table to make sure that everyone gets to do something.
Yeah, and I will not recommend that you play Monster of the Week with 7 players, because that's a lot for a PBTA game, but I have done that. And also because that's a game where like you move from daytime to evening, and the monster is doing what it's doing, and if you don't discover it at a certain time, it's going to get what it wants. But I generally make sure that everybody at the table has done something. I don't just wait for them all to jump in and say, I want to do this, I want to do this, because sometimes there's 2 or 3 people, especially at a table with 7 people, that never got a chance to do something. So before I move on to the next phase of the day, I will go, hey, was there anything that you wanted to accomplish? Hey, what was your character up to? It's not as formalized, no, but as GMs, managing the spotlight on our players is very important.
It's a whole other topic that I think we may have covered on the Gnomecast. Learning how to balance between your dominant players and your passive players is very important as a GM. And initiative is just one of the most basic mechanics that you can use to help make sure that everyone gets a little bit of time. Although I will say you do have to be careful of the dominant player who wants to boss the passive players around.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're a pain in the butt.
Definitely. Well, and I think what's interesting is a lot of this discussion that I saw happened around people that are very much only doing one type of gaming. And the 2 of us are not people that fall into that category.
Like we're polygamers or something. So are there any optional rules for initiative in official 5e stuff?
Why, yes, there are. What's always interesting to me is there are so many optional rules in the DMG, and I swear people do not know that half of these things exist. I still to this day will see somebody like post a video on YouTube saying, you should try doing this in D&D. And they think it's something that they came up with out of nowhere, and it's actually something that's been in the DMG since 2014. No shade to them, just saying, read your DMG sometime.
Yeah, the DMG's got a lot of got a lot of gold nuggets in it.
Oh yeah. So, one of the first things is just basically saying you can do side initiative if you want. The downside to that is you're not rewarding people that have higher dexterity scores, and you're also, there's a few class features here and there that really will give you advantage on initiative that you're kind of giving short shrift if you do just flat out side initiative. Both of you roll a die, whoever gets higher goes.
That would kind of screw over Kazina,
Mm-hmm.
because she's got something like a +9 to initiative, because some of her class abilities double her initiative bonus, and she goes first.
Oh yeah. The other favorite from the DMG is bringing back the Blast from the Past, the Speed Factor initiative, which basically gives you a whole bunch of different actions that you might take in a round and gives them a bonus to, how much that takes and adds to the roll. And then whoever, rolls, actually, I think they reversed it there. So faster actions have a higher bonus, but you roll individually, but you roll every round because what you're doing that will use a speed factor could change every round. I personally would not use this option, but it is an option that exists in the 2014 DMG for 5th edition D&D.
That's for the masochists out there.
Yeah, well, no, we have another thing that was introduced for 5e that is more masochistic, but I want to finish at the DMG first.
Finish. Go ahead. Go forth. Finish the DMG stuff.
This is the one that I actually like because I have used a form of it, and that is initiative scores. And what initiative scores are is it is 10 plus your dexterity bonus plus whatever else you might get for your initiative, and that's your score. And when you go into initiative, everybody tells you their score, and you rank them. And part of what you could do with that is your PCs are always going to be in the same spots, and you can just slot your monsters in wherever they go. For someone asking, but wait, what if I have advantage or disadvantage? It is a general rule in D&D 5e, anytime your normal roll would become a passive score, and you would have advantage, you add 5 to that score. If your normal roll would have disadvantage and it becomes a passive score, you subtract 5, and that's all you would do with a side initiative too.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, when I say I have used this, what I mean by that is I have used this by giving it to monsters before. I still have, the player's roll, but I'm just, especially if I have a lot of monsters, it's a lot easier just to say, okay, that one's a 12, that one's a 15, that one's an 8, and just put them in there instead of rolling for each individual one.
That makes sense.
What's interesting about this is I did not realize this until a few days ago, but apparently, just like how they have average damage for monsters in the 2014 D&D books, they are going to have an initiative score for monsters in the 2024 rules.
Interesting.
I kind of like players still having the excitement of rolling initiative, but it can be a lot faster when you're just plugging the monsters' numbers in.
Yeah. I have some friends who run Mutants and Masterminds, and at the table they will have their laptop, and they usually have Hero Labs up, and so they have all the characters in Hero Labs, and they'll just hit the button to roll initiative, and so I never actually get to roll my own initiative, and while the game is usually absolutely fantastic, otherwise I'm like, but it's my initiative. Why didn't I roll it?
I used Hero Lab when I was running my DC Adventures game, and it was people were just so disappointed because it's okay, I have what order you guys are going in, and it's but I wanted to roll.
Tell us about this masochistic initiative system.
All right, there is a form of optional initiative for D&D 5e that is so vile and scary that it is no longer visible on the site, but the link will still take you to that document. And that is the Unearthed Arcana for what was called Greyhawk Initiative. Greyhawk Initiative is lowest goes first. Well, you may think that this is going to be similar to other editions where they're saying lowest goes first and you add something to that roll. No, everything is ranked in dice. So if you're using a longsword, you are using a d8 for your initiative. However, if you're using a longsword and you're going to use your bonus action to attack with a short sword, you will now be rolling a d8 plus a d6. So not only were you looking up a different score based on what you were going to be doing when you roll initiative, you were actually looking at a different dice step for what you're doing. And it kind of got a little bit back to that idea where you had to announce what you were doing before you rolled initiative because you didn't know what you were rolling initiative, what dice you were using for initiative until you announced, okay, I am going to use my longsword and then I am going to also use my offhand attack. And so therefore I need to roll dice for both of those.
Yeah, when you have to announce what you're doing at the start of the round, it doesn't allow you to adapt or accommodate to things changing throughout the round.
Yes, and that is very much not how 5th edition has been designed. Honestly, like back in earlier editions when you had to announce what you were doing and somebody hits the wizard before he gets to cast his spell, that's how you knew a spell was disrupted. The thing is, 5th edition has all these other rules for figuring that out that are based on not declaring what you're doing first. So it's already kind of taken all this stuff into account that you're now taking back away. And the other thing is, this punishes you for having a bonus action.
Yeah.
Like, oddly enough, if you are a 2-weapon fighter, if you're a ranger or a thief, you are probably slower than the fighter with his longsword.
Because you got to roll for both weapons in your hands. That's not cool.
I think we're going to put a link because you can still find the document. It's still hosted on Wizard's site. It's just not one that comes up when you look for Unearthed Arcana. So if anyone wants to see this form of initiative, which I do not recommend anyone ever use, you can go to that link that we'll have for the episode and see it for yourself.
Let's talk about alternative initiative mechanics from other games that we could pull in to 5e.
One of my favorites that has actually been something that's used in a lot of narrative games, going back to that discussion earlier, is just having a handoff or a popcorn initiative where everybody decides who goes first and that person decides who goes next after them.
The way I've usually seen it done is everyone rolls for initiative and the person who's highest is the one who gets to do something first, but then they choose who they hand it off to. One of the interesting things I found about this is you also can hand off to the enemies. And there is actually some tactics to not waiting until the end to give it to the enemies. Because if you wait until the end and the enemies get to go last, guess who's going to get to go first in the next round?
Oh, yeah.
The enemies, because they're not going to give it to you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting thing. It's an interesting style of initiative that I've seen in play.
The first place I ever encountered it myself was in Marvel Heroic. It's also what they use for the Sentinel Comics RPG. And it is interesting because as it's written in those things, basically if somebody does something to trigger a fight, they're the first one to go. Like if somebody says, I'm going to blast him in the face, it's like, okay, you get to go first. It does kind of alleviate a little bit of that weirdness that D&D has where it's like, I'm going to stab this person. All right, well, everyone roll for initiative. You were very ready to stab them and everyone else went before you. But when you mentioned that about rolling for initiative to see who starts everything off, that is how Pugmire does it, which if you have not seen it, Pugmire, at least the first edition of Pugmire, is very much based on the 5e SRD. So there's a lot of 5th edition D&D feeling to it, except that classes are kind of custom built a little bit more. But it uses the handoff mode for initiative, but you still roll to start. So there's still a benefit for somebody that has a high dexterity because that person's more likely to be one of the people that gets to start the combat off in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I was going to say about the handoff initiative is there's an interesting twist on that because, for example, Star Trek Adventures uses that. But in Star Trek Adventures, you can't hand off to someone on your side while there are still enemies that haven't gone.
Oh.
So you have to go back and forth until you're out of opposing characters.
That's interesting. I have to say, I have never actually been in a combat or action scene in Star Trek Adventures that would need that, because we usually end up solving things with thinking and science and diplomacy.
Yeah. Well, and I had so many times when it was like someone, even if it did get down to violence, it was like, I am going to hit them with, stun from my phaser. And then they would do it and they stunned the person and stopped them from doing whatever they were going to do. And that's the scene. It didn't turn into a regular combat.
Now, this is, to be fair, absolutely no shade on Star Trek Adventures. It's a fantastic game.
No, that's the way Star Trek should be.
But I know my one campaign, my poor GM kept trying to give us some kind of combat. And I think the only time a phaser was fired in person-to-person range was when the doctor got possessed and we stunned him into unconsciousness. And then we had a ship battle that was completely negated when our engineer and our pilot basically did some shenanigans with tractor beams and making it into a tractor net and just taking out all of the enemy's ships. It was absolutely brilliant.
Someday we will probably need to do a show about stakes in RPGs, because one of the interesting things about Star Trek Adventures is, even if you don't get into combat, if a section of your ship gets damaged, the GM is supposed to roll a d6 to see if someone in that section got injured. So there is still that feeling like if one of those consoles that the Federation keeps putting in that blows up and people's faces goes off, your doctor may still need to run down to, deck C and stabilize somebody because this, you still rolled that somebody got injured in it. And like I said, that is a discussion for another day. I have said this online. Death is not the only stakes that you can have in a game. However, I've seen people go too far the other direction and say, oh, she's never try and kill people. Death is a perfectly acceptable set of stakes for a game too. It's just there should be other stakes as well.
Okay, let's talk about other initiative systems.
Real simple one here. A lot of the Free League games, they just give you cards that are numbered 1 through 10, and you go, whoever gets the lowest card goes, and you just go in order. And that they've used that for a lot of them.
Savage Worlds. It's a deck of cards. You deal it out. The highest card goes. There's a ranking for the suits, and there's special things that happen when a Joker comes out.
What's interesting about card-based initiative is, for one thing, I know that they do this in Savage Worlds. Someone that is faster can draw multiple cards and pick the better of the cards that they drew, which is also true. There's certain abilities in the Free League games that will let you do that too. But the other thing that's interesting about that is, for example, in Dragonbane, if you have a monster that goes more than one time, they draw an initiative card for each time that they go.
No, that makes sense.
It's interesting. I'm not 100% sure how I would adapt that one to D&D, just because there's a lot going. I mean, it's a very simple initiative style. I just am trying to reconcile how that would work with everything else that goes on in D&D.
There's a bunch of these initiative systems we're talking about that we're not necessarily saying use these in your D&D game, but I think it's good to understand how other initiative systems work to understand how better to use the system in the game you're running.
And, I mean, you may have players that never take any of those things that give them advantage or disadvantage on rolls or anything like that. And if that's the case, then you could probably just deal out cards and do what you're going to do. The only thing I would say there is you probably shouldn't spread out your monster's attacks on different initiative counts, because that's more of what legendary actions do in D&D as opposed to the monster just having multiple attacks.
Yeah.
So another interesting one is Shadow the Demon Lord. What that one does is it has slow turns and fast turns. Players always go first in whatever phase of initiative you're in. You get to take a fast turn when you are only either moving or attacking. So if you're not going anywhere but you're attacking, that's a fast turn. If you're going to move but not do anything else, that's a fast turn. So everyone that's taking a fast turn that's a player character would go first. Every monster that's going to, take a fast turn goes. Then every player that's taking a slow turn, which is you are moving and taking an action, then you would go next. And then the monsters that are moving and taking an action would then go next. The other thing that's really interesting about this form of initiative is that there is an end of round phase. So one of the things that sometimes gets a little messy when you don't have people acting on the exact same turn is that if you have, say, a spell that ends at the end of your turn, and you can juggle around what order people go, you can actually make that spell last longer because of things like that. What the end of round phase does in Shadow the Demon Lord is most of those things that say this goes until your next turn go until the end of round phase. And the other thing about the end of round phase is, I don't know how many times I have gone, wait, do I take the ongoing fire damage on my turn, or do I take the ongoing fire damage on the thing's turn that inflicted it on me? In Shadow the Demon Lord, that end of round phase, that's when you do ongoing damage too.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
It's with Spirit Guardians. When am I taking damage with this?
It's not that there are not answers to these things, and it's not too difficult to figure them out, but I do also kind of like that idea that you have that end of round phase just to say, okay, it's the end of round. We'll see how on fire you are. We'll see. We'll take care of all of that after we have all done our actions and done things. I think this one is workable for D&D. It does feel a little off because you don't get a move action in D&D. You get movement that you can split up between other things that you're doing.
Which is an important aspect of 5th edition, I think, is that your movement can be split up.
Yeah, and I think if you have the fast turns and slow turns like that, and let's say you just need to move 10 feet, it feels like you're kind of doing something detrimental because all of a sudden now you have to take a fast turn if you want to attack, or a slow turn if you want to attack.
So speaking of movement, whether you have to take it all at once or it can be split up, let's talk about older versions of initiative and other rules that people think are still in the game. Because that movement is a thing. I still, to this day, 10 years after 5th edition came out, people ask, wait, can I move after I attack? Can I move after I do this action?
If you are one of the people that did not play D&D until 5th edition, welcome. Also, in 3rd edition, in order to move between actions, there was a feat chain that you actually had to take. So you had to burn multiple feats so that you could actually do that. The reason you had to take multiple feats was you could do it with one feat, but then you would still take an attack of opportunity. So then if you took another one, you could do it and not take an attack of opportunity.
Mobility and then move by action?
Yeah, I think so. And then I forget what the last one was. The last one that made you not take attacks of opportunity.
And you had to have dodge to get mobility.
Yes.
And you couldn't get move by action until you had mobility.
Right. So basically you were looking at least 2 or 3 feats in order to be able to move between your actions, which is why a lot of people that played a lot of 3rd edition or Pathfinder still have that feeling once in a while that, wait, I don't have to take all of my move first or all of my move at the end. I can split it up between attacks. Yes, you can. I just stabbed something in the face and there's something over there that I want to get to and I still have 10 feet of movement. I can do that. Yes, you can. One of the things that I think is funny, because I still hear it come up and I fall into saying it every once in a while, and that is there is no such thing as a surprise round anymore. If someone is surprised, they do not act in the first round of combat. But someone can be surprised and still have other people on their side acting. Therefore, you still go through the regular initiative count. Everybody rolls for initiative. It's just that when it gets to their turn, they cannot do anything. And then as soon as their turn is up, they now have a reaction again because they don't have a reaction until after their turn.
Yeah.
So there's no surprise round. There's just a first round where you may not get to do anything.
I mean, in some ways it kind of works similar to a surprise round, but I think in play it actually ends up being simpler because it's just figure out who's surprised. They don't get to act this turn.
It is also important because of things like reactions, because like you said with Shield, if it's your turn and it's a surprise round, you can't act. But if someone attacks you after your turn in that first round, you can use Shield. And that's important because it's not a surprise round. You can still act. You still have your thing as soon as your turn is up. So there's some interesting, important timing that has to do with how 5th edition does things that are why there isn't a surprise round anymore.
And as we've already mentioned, there's also the hold action thing. People will constantly say, I'm going to hold my action. And like,
no, you're
sorry,
not.
dude, that's not a thing in 5e anymore. You can tell me what you want to ready an action for. And to be completely honest, I will usually be kind to my players. And if their thing doesn't trigger, I'll probably let them do something.
Here's a hint for anybody that wants to hold an action and realizes there is not a hold action. Your trigger can be once my party member has taken an action, and then you go after them.
Yeah.
That is like where you want to see what they're doing first and then go. You can't always make it that. The trigger has to be something that you can observe, but it doesn't have to be something very specific. It doesn't have to be if they stab someone or if they attack someone with a longsword. It can be once my companion takes their turn, I will then go.
Like I said, I play rogues all the time. This is important for rogues and getting that sweet, sweet sneak attack damage.
Yep.
You want to roll those extra dice. So you need somebody else to be on the person you want to murder. I tend to refer to a lot of these types of things as addition screen burn, which I don't know if this is something people experience on modern LCD monitors.
yeah, that is, yeah.
But back in the day on our old CRTs, if you left a window up too long on your screen, it could get burned into the monitor and it would always be there no matter what you did. And that's what a lot of these rules are like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like hold an action. It was such a common thing in all of the D20 games from 2000 on up.
Mm-hmm.
And so people think it's a thing, and it's not. You know, it's the movement thing.
Oh, yeah.
There are all these things. Flanking. Flanking is something people still go, I'm flanking. Does that get me a bonus? No, it doesn't get you a bonus. If you're a rogue, it'll let you sneak attack damage, but it's not actually a rule anymore.
I blame flanking partially on Critical Role, because Critical Role was using the optional flanking rules, again, optional flanking rules in the 2014 DMG, where you would get advantage if you flank someone. I think that's way too much of a bonus. That is effectively a +5 if somebody is attacking the same person. So I'm not a fan of that rule, but they used it a lot and never necessarily called it out as an optional rule. They don't have to. It's an actual play. You should read the rules yourself. But I'm just saying.
In Critical Role's defense, they transitioned from playing Pathfinder to playing 5e. That's why one of the characters was a gunslinger.
Exactly.
Because that's what he was in Pathfinder. And when they decided to play 5e, well, okay, let's make a gunslinger class.
And I believe there was even one point in time where Matt explained to everyone, because he had been using the term surprise round, and he stopped in one session and explained there is no such thing as a surprise round. I have been misspeaking when I said this. This is how it works.
So let's move on and talk about some best practices. What can we do to make initiative run as smooth as possible?
All right. So all you have to do to part me with money is show me gadgets. So I am going to talk about some gadgets that I think are neat. A couple of years back when I was at GaryCon, I saw this thing it is a stand with a pole, and it had dry erase flags on it. And you would write the names of everybody in initiative, and then you just drop those flags onto the pole. And whenever someone goes, you turn their flag to the opposite direction, and then the next person in line on the flag goes. And then at the end of the round, you just flip all of those flags back the other direction, and you start over again.
I have seen something cheaper, similar. If you are a GM who likes having a GM screen up at the table, clothespins.
Mm-hmm.
Clothespins with either a little bit of paper stuck to them or whatever. You can put the character's name on the Post-its. On the clothespins, and just put them in order on top of your GM screen.
And if you, like me, are unwise enough to want to spend money on a very simple solution that you could do yourself, there are, and actually I'll get to this a little bit later when we get to the downtime research thing, but there are companies, there are actually some PDFs that you can get on DriveThruRPG that do that same thing, except it gives you like the characters, you have a spot to put the character's armor class and some of their stats that you would need to reference on that thing that you're hanging from the DM screen, so that and it hangs on the DM side so that you don't have to ask somebody like, what's your armor class every time, because it's right there on the tab that you're tracking their initiative with.
Now, I have a confession to make. I have spent some money on gadgets for tracking initiative and then invariably replace them. So initiative, when I am running in person, is always in pencil in my GM notes right there with I'll just go around the table. Okay, does anybody have 20 or above? Okay, I'll write their names down. Okay, does anybody have 15 or above? Write their names down. And, just go around the table, get everyone's name down.
And what's funny about that is I will buy these gadgets all the time, exactly like you were saying. And right now, the face-to-face game that I'm running once a month, I don't use any of them to track initiative. I just write it down on a piece of paper. However, I like the option. It's fancy.
It's fancy. It's cool. And let's be honest, for those of us who are running online, the VTTs kind of do this for you.
Yeah.
Some better than others, but it's still right there. There's an initiative tracker for you on the screen.
Now, if you want to spend money and still just write down initiative, Wizards came out with 2 Dungeon Master screen. One was like the Wilderness Dungeon Master screen, and the other one was the Dungeon Master screen that has a few things to remind you of, like, what you need to do on a trip or whatever. But there was also a dry erase sheet in both of those where you could just write down initiatives, which is good because then you're not wasting lots of paper and you make yourself feel better about buying something other than just writing it on paper. I will say too, I think the absolute best product though for being a dry erase thing that you write initiative down on is still the Pathfinder combat pad, which is, they came out with that early. Actually, I believe that predates Pathfinder. It was just something that they made.
It does. The one I spent money on was before Pathfinder came out, and I lost it. It's probably buried somewhere here in the house.
But I mean, they're really nice. It's a dry erase thing, and there's little magnets, and it's magnetized, and you can write somebody's name and their initiative score on it and put them in order. And part of why this is, a 3rd edition Pathfinder product is they're magnets so that you could slide them up and down the initiative if something changed. But it still works perfectly well for 5th edition D&D. And honestly, it is one of my favorite gadgets for tracking initiative. And it's not much more than just writing it on a piece of paper, but it feels different. And I use this for a long, long time. It's only really been since after the pandemic, and I've readopted running things face to face, that I kind of lost track of where mine's at and don't use it.
Let's move away from spending money and talk about best practices and just things that we can do to help facilitate initiative in our games.
You mentioned something earlier, which is something I was going to bring out. And it kind of goes back to, if you watch Matt Mercer, whenever they roll for initiative, it's not just everybody shout your initiative out and I'll try and write it down as everybody's talking, because I have done that before and I will invariably lose track. And what's even worse is when somebody rolls initiative, tells you initiative immediately when 3 other people tells you, and you come back to them and they're like, I don't remember what I rolled. So what Matt does is exactly what you were saying. He'll be like, is anybody between 30 and 20? Is anybody between, 19 and 15? And he'll call that out in segments, and then people will say, I'm in that segment, this is my score, and write it down that way. And I think that's a good way to break down, especially when you are like Matt and you have a lot of players.
I generally run for 6.
Mm-hmm.
While we usually play online, we treasure the times we get together and play in person. And it's like everyone will be like, oh, I got a this, I got a that. But they know to remember their score for when I ask for it.
Mm-hmm.
And you get that poor person who has a 2 waiting and waiting and waiting.
Are you between 10 and 15?
I got a 2.
No. Are you between 5 and 10? No.
The regular joke is you get to go at the top of the next round.
The other thing that I've seen other people do is to let one of your players, especially somebody that is maybe playing a class that doesn't have as many fiddly bits to them, track initiative for you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a good option. This is an option I can't do because I can't let go of initiative because I'm just so used to tracking initiative as part of what a GM does. That is not me saying that's the way you should do it. That is me saying I can't rip that out of me and not do it reflexively.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could do that either. What I will do is related to another best practice I want to talk about. And that's if I have a player who I trust with the mechanics and the rules, I'll nudge them towards helping a player that's newer or still learning or not as sure what they want to do. Because one of the very important things with initiative is to make sure the game keeps moving. I think one of the biggest complaints about Dungeons and Dragons is that combats take forever, which is why something like Daggerheart is trying to do something a little more initiative, because there is that feeling that the game grinds to a halt for this combat to happen, and it can start feeling a little stodgy and boring. And part of that comes from everyone's turn taking an excessive amount of time, because you get to the next player and they're, I don't know. I'm going to look up this spell. I'm going to look up this spell. And it's like, you want to make sure that everyone is as ready as possible on their turn to take their action.
From the player side, when I was running I often cite my character from Princes of the Apocalypse, but that's because he got up to 13th level, and that's the highest level 5th edition character that I've played. But when we were playing in that campaign, as soon as my turn was over, and we had like 8 people at that table, as soon as my turn was over, I was thinking about, okay, if I'm going to use this spell, I want to look it up and make sure that I know exactly how it works. And then somebody would do something stupid and I would have to change my plan. But I was immediately planning for that next action once my action was done, because I was a cleric and I have lots of spells to go through, and I want to make sure I'm not slowing the game down by not knowing what they do.
Everyone's a little different. Everyone's going to come at this slightly differently. We've got players who are slightly neurodivergent, who have different ways of handling this type of thing. We need to have some grace with each other. But at the same time as having grace for everyone at the table, we need to have courtesy for everyone at the table. And that means trying to be as on top of your turn as you want to be. And everyone ends up in a situation where you have a plan, and then right before your turn, it's completely screwed. Jared and I were recently playing a game that you will all probably find out about soon. And I had a plan, and it was a good plan. And right before my turn, it completely went out the window because I could not do my plan anymore. And this big moment that I wanted for my character was just poof, gone through the floor like a shadow.
A lot like that.
A lot like that, yeah. But it's just, you gotta still be on the ball. And this goes for the GM, making sure you're keeping things moving, understanding which of your players may need a little more time or a little more help in figuring out what they need to do next. But players also need to be aware of, it's your turn, go, do the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's going to be, everyone should have understanding and grace if you're not quite sure on how a rule works, and talking through it and getting it right if you can, but you don't want to let these things slow the game down too much.
Right. And honestly, that is something that is important no matter if you use any of these alternates that we have talked about. All of this other stuff is still important.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reason, going back to the very beginning, the reason that we do initiative in the first place is to make sure everybody gets their turn, everybody gets to do what they wanted to do, and combat moves smoothly. That isn't just knowing the numbers and the order, that is making sure that everybody does take their turn and, gets the things done that they need to get done, and then moves on to the next person.
I will say, I think as a last bit of advice for initiative, is this is not meant to replace the flavor and the excitement of a combat. You want to make sure you're still making things exciting and full of flavor for your players through that combat. Otherwise, I got an 18. Does that hit? Is it dead yet? Okay, next turn. You really need to still throw in the flavor. The initiative is just there to help us get through the combat and make sure everyone gets a chance to do something awesome.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, also, DMs, if you want to do something awesome with your NPCs that have legendary actions, remember you take legendary actions after someone else's turn. So if your monster has not gone yet in the first round, they already have legendary actions from the start. Don't tell your players this.
Don't tell your players.
Surprise them.
Legendary actions are evil. Use them for good.
No time for rest, you two. Get on with your downtime research.
Well, I think we go to the phase of initiative now where we're going to do downtime research. So every episode, we're going to look at something related to D&D that we want to pass along to our listeners. It might be products, websites, videos, or podcasts, but it will always be something that we think will enhance your D&D experience.
Hey, the Lego D&D set is here. This is based on a fan concept from last year's Lego Ideas contest for a D&D based design. And this was developed from one of 600 entries. The set is not for the faint of heart, as it has over 3,500 pieces and is priced at $359, which, I mean, that's pretty normal for a Lego set of this size.
Yeah.
It is available for early order for Lego Insider customers on April 1st, but for general customers, the general public, hey, it's going to be available on April 4th, which is tomorrow if you're listening to this on the day it releases. To be completely fair, I am much more excited about the minifig set that will be coming this September, though there have been pictures circulating of this set, but I am told by some Lego experts that those may not be official, or if they are official, they're leaked because Lego itself has not released images of the minifigs that are going to be in that set. So if you've seen the image floating around that has a Lady of Pain and a Dragonborn and all sorts of other cool, all sorts of other cool stuff in it, that may or may not be real, but that is coming in September.
If it is real, I am going to start buying those little baggies of D&D minifigs, though, because if there is a Strahd Lego, I want a Strahd minifig.
I want them all. I've already told my Lego expert that I want that whole set. So we will see. We'll have a link to the article about this from D&D Beyond, which has a link to the Lego website where you can order everything.
This time around, I wanted to talk about Stat Trackers, which is a line from Top Dog Games. I was just poking around the internet, looking for in-person gaming gadgets, in part because of my Saturday game, and I kind of want to start using more gadgets. And there are some really neat things in this line of products. There are initiative cards that you can hang from the DM screen, like we were talking about earlier, but there are initiative cards that have all of the 5th edition stats for something printed on it. So, like, there was one that had, like, all of the stats for an Aboleth on the inside that faces the DM. So it's not just that you know its initiative score and its armor class, it's got all of it there so you can reference it. And they sell like really big boxes of these things. They sell blank ones where you can write your own NPCs or PCs on them. There are organizational boxes for you to put all of those monster stat trackers in there. And there's also a dry erase GM screen. And you may ask, why would I write on my GM screen? Well, it's got a section on it for tracking hit points. What you do basically is they're grouped in like 5x5 segments, and you circle the number of hit points that a monster has, and you just mark off the circles when something takes damage. You may say, I can do math, Jared. I will counter with subtracting actually takes more energy than adding does. And I know you can do math, dear listener. However, if your cognitive load is lower when you are the DM, that's a good thing.
I can speak to this. There have been times where I've been trying to do math and my brain stops. I stare at my players with this confused expression, and then the math hits and I write it down and we move on. But that's a speed bump. That is a mental speed bump in that game. And
literally you do addition faster in your head than you do subtraction. So I kind of like that idea that you have this dry erase thing where you can just say, okay, this guy has 30 hit points. I'm going to circle all of these columns and then just mark each one off as they take damage, and then I'll know when they're dead. And it has just this big thing of those, so you can like dry erase and circle a certain amount for each one.
Nice.
They also have little pads of paper that do the exact same thing if you don't want the dry erase GM screen. All I'm saying is these things look really nice and they're gadgets. And this is the okay. Unlike D&D 5e, there are plenty of things to spend money on in real life. However, I still look for things to spend money on, even though I shouldn't. We will also have the link in the show notes for Stat Trackers.
Let's get out of here before Jared spends any more money. We are happily part of the Polygamers Podcast Network, helping you run and play your best games. We think you'll enjoy another Polygamers podcast like
Misdirected Mark Plays. Phil, Chris, Bob, and Jerry play and discuss a campaign that they have created and are playing. Now, instead of just hearing them talk about the theory of gaming, and game mastering of the games that they have played, you can actually hear what they do at the table. It's come full circle in their exploratory play series, MM Plays.
We've used up all of our resources, so I think it's time for a long rest. I mean, it took me a while to get through initiative. I hope this adventure was rewarding for you. We hope you'll go exploring with us when we start our next adventure and roll initiative again.